My name is Natalie Patterson. I went to South Pasadena High School and I graduated in 2002.
Do you remember what grade your sex ed started in?
It might have been like 10th or 11th grade in conjunction with driver's ed. So he was like, okay, I'm gonna teach you about driving because I'm more comfortable with that. And then here's this book and you just like read it if you wanna know. And he would just like highlight certain aspects that he probably was like mandated to highlight, but he was not, for sure was not comfortable. It for sure was not a welcoming environment. It was just like, we gotta get through this, do what you need to do. I don't know exactly what age I was when I became interested in sex, but I know that sexuality was always a thing. I was really aware of it, even as a little kid. I also was molested as a kid, so sexuality was like, I was very aware of it at the point when I was aware that that was wrong. Then the shame comes and all of that, so I think it all kind of came around the same time. I think sexuality became a conversation in relationships probably in like 5th grade, I think was my like first kiss. And I was involved with a boy who was a year older and was clearly far more experienced than I was. And he was like very aggressive. Like I remember my first kiss being this very like aggressive kind of thing that I was like turned off by because it was like sleazy. It wasn't like beautiful and like kind and loving. It was like, it was aggressive and messy. And I wasn't really into that. My like first real serious boyfriend was when I was 15 and I lost my virginity to him at 16. I was already having sex by the time we had sex ed. Okay, so here's the thing about explaining the birds and the bees and the sex and all that stuff. My father was not around and my mom is a single hardworking woman. And so there was just a lot of things that were not discussed fully unless I brought it up. We didn't really talk about sex so much unless I like asked a question, but I distinctively remember asking her somewhere around the time I was like considering having sex with my boyfriend. I asked her how to give head. And my mother died. She died, I mean, because like whose mom, like whoever wants their daughter to ask that question, like just in life in general. But I was curious and I didn't know, and I felt like the best person to ask was my mother, a person that I loved and trusted, and she would be honest. And she was like, what do you think, I'm a porn star? I don't know. And I was like, I'm alive, so I'm assuming some things have happened to get me here. She was very bashful and she was like, if you wanna know, I'll get you a video. You know, they sell videos and I'll like get you some kind of educational video. She did not get the video. I think I'm unique in that way. I don't think most kids would do that. Here's the thing. I think generally education is taught in the most ass-backwards way. We don't teach from a human perspective. We teach from a textbook and like from standards passed down by the state. And like, that's just what it is. It's a task list to get done, not humans trying to educate other humans. And it's not about actually educating and inspiring young people. It's just about getting through standards. And I think generally that's the way American education is, if it's not private or charter school, or some super innovative young people who get burnt out because we don't pay them shit. Maybe like a year and a half ago, I was sexually assaulted by a close friend. I had slept with him before, but was no longer. It was a very like awkward, murky situation. In my brain, I was like, I can't deal with this right now. I have too much in my life going on. I can't deal with like being sexually assaulted. I can't deal with that being like a name and a title and a thing I have to own and deal with. So I just like moved on until I went to the doctor and I was like, I need to do blood work and let's just do STD panel and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, let's just like clear house and make sure everything's fine. They call, of course, 3 days later and they say, actually, you have an STD, you have chlamydia, it's totally curable, everything's fine, but you should just know. And it was this interesting thing because then I had all of this shame and felt like I was disgusting and like wanted to like carve my insides out. But it was like, why was it my shame to carry, number one? And number two, shit happens is the reality, and it's not about what's happening, it's about how we handle what's happening. And so I was like honest with my mom and I called her and I was like, so I never really talked about this, but I was sexually assaulted. And I went to the doctor and I got the test and I have chlamydia, I took the pills, everything is fine. But like, I just wanted you to know because I have all these like feelings and I'm like gonna go to rape trauma therapy because I feel like that's the most safe thing to do. to like deal with my mental health associated with it. And my mom was like, well, why don't you use condoms? And I was like, I said I was sexually assaulted, which means I didn't even consent. So of course there wasn't a condom. But it was this interesting thing of like not even hearing me say I was sexually assaulted and just going to like, how could you have this thing? And I was like, we're all completely demented. And so I went into this conversation of saying to her, I've never heard you say you got tested. In my whole life, Mom, I've never heard you say you got tested. Have you been tested? And then she's like, well, she got uncomfortable because now I'm like, well, if you want to talk about my mistakes, let's talk about probably where they started. Like, you not being honest, you not being forthcoming. And then I said, well, you know, I've never heard you say that you use condoms in my whole life. I've never even seen condoms in our house in my whole life. I know you've slept with people, so what's up with that? Like, if we want to really talk about these things, like, I'll go there. If we don't, then you should like back up off me because this is a sensitive moment that you're coming at me for, when like that's not even the appropriate response to someone saying that they've been sexually assaulted and then subsequently get a STD. Like, that's not how you deal with that. But I also understand that generally we don't educate people on how to talk about these things, so people have terrible responses to them. And the professionals who do have this skill set are underfunded, under-resourced, and not doing community-based work because they have to make a living too. I just wish there was an environment where where who I uniquely wasn't ignored. I was a young Black girl in predominantly white schools, and my race was completely ignored for most of my educational experience. But I was different than every other person in the school. I had different issues. And so ignoring them, how are you preparing me for the future if you're not preparing me as a Black woman in the world? My Black experience is gonna be different than my white counterparts. And to ignore that is like, how? How are you educating me then? We don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same expectations. Like, the world is not gonna respond to us in the same way. And I think, you know, I mean, I can remember experiences like, I got boobs probably in like 3rd grade. So I looked different than the white girls in my classes who had no boobs and really thin bodies. And I was like this curvaceous 3rd grader, right? But then there was like all this conversation of like, well, Natalie, you need to wear something different because you're a distraction to boys. Not like, so let's talk about bodies and let's talk about development and let's talk about these things as they're occurring. We're just ignoring them and isolating specific people. And I think that fundamentally that is just toxic and like dehumanizing. So I wish everything was different, and I wish kids would have the freedom to learn in like the authentic way that makes sense for them. And since kids are all different, why do we have so many things that are blanketed for everybody? It's like, well, everybody doesn't need the same things. So I was teaching in a program 2 years ago in Watts. We realized that all of the kids were sexually active for the most part, or were going to be, or were pretending they were, or whatever, but sexuality and sex were a big part of their identities in like 5th or 6th grade. And so we realized, you guys don't know anything, and this is so dangerous. And not only do you already live in a place where you're really at high risk for having a shitty life, now you could get pregnant and make someone else's life shitty, or make your own worse. So we kind of took it upon ourselves to like just start a little sex ed class. And so my friend and I, we just were like researching and getting pictures and like getting the PowerPoint together. And we like sent a notice to the parents and said like, hey, we're doing this. If you don't want your kid to be a part of this, you need to sign it and return it. We made it in a way that it would benefit the most kids. And some people's parents were like, no, I don't want my kid learning that. The people who said no, we called their parent and said, well, we just want you to know what we're teaching them, to even initiate a conversation with the parents to be like, well, what is their level of discomfort? What do they know? Like, why are they saying no? Maybe if we talk to them, we can encourage them to say yes. A lot of parents were like, oh, okay, we see what you're trying to do. Okay, cool. There were still some parents that were hard-nosed. But for the most part, we had 50 kids in each class, and we taught them a bunch of stuff, and we answered all of their questions. And I always try to, in all the work that I do, try to create a safe space for people to be honest and tell the truth. And then I always want to be a person who will help and try to find an answer. And I don't know everything. Like, I don't claim to know everything, but I know that I can help. And so that's what I try to do. And so in that situation, I answered every awkward question that, you know, the kids would ask. So we talked about healthy relationships and boundaries and consent, and like that your body gets to do what it wants to do. And if you don't want to do it, you get to say no and go home. But also like creating safety nets and having a community of support, and like not going to a boy's house if no one knows that you're going. Someone should know, so that if something happens, someone can help you. Just being proactive and being smart, and how that, you know, connects to self-esteem and womanhood and identity and all of these things. And like we were connecting it to the larger things, because it's not just about sex. Like it's about who you are as a sexual person. We had an agenda, but of course they had questions that we hadn't even thought of. And we were like, what? Or kids being like, well, what's anal sex? Or how do you have anal sex? And I was like, well, I'll talk to you tomorrow about that, because I don't know today. You know, I don't know. And also about like educating ourselves as adults, but also being willing to say, you know, there were questions that kids asked that I was like, you know, I honestly don't know the answer, because that's not something that I do. And then they were like, well, how come? And I'm like, well, because everybody gets to do what they want to do. And that's just not something I feel comfortable with, or that's not something I've encountered. Just all of these things that, you know, nobody's parents are talking about, because they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to deal with it themselves, so they definitely don't want to deal with it with their kid. But I'm like, you had a kid though, so you gotta be grown-up time and be awkward and tell the truth. I understand the apprehension most adults have about talking about these things, but I think we owe it to ourselves, but also to the future, to have whole, beautiful, spirited kids who become adults. Like, we do a disservice to ourselves. Like, we're gonna depend on these people at some point. They're gonna run the country and the world. And if they're idiots, we have to live in a world, and then our grandkids and you know what I mean? Like, I just don't understand how people don't see the connection of like, that if you don't go all in and participate fully, things are fractured. And then we get to live in the fracture.